Imagine waking up one morning to find your driveway blocked, your yard gefenst auf und dein eigen Zuhaus plötzlich gefangen in einer Barrier, der du nie zugestimmt hast. That's exactly what happened when a homeowner came face to face with a homeowners association determined to control every inch of the neighborhood, even property they didn't own. At first, it looked like an ordinary dispute over boundaries and rules. But what began as petty harassment quickly spiraled into a battle of power, pride, and revenge. How far would you go if your freedom on your own land was stolen overnight? For years, Daniel thought he had finally found peace. After a lifetime of saving, he purchased a modest ranch-style home on the edge of a quiet, gated community. The place wasn't extravagant, but it was his dream, a wide stretch of land, a sturdy barn out back, and enough space between neighbors to breathe. The kind of property where you could wake up to birds instead of traffic, where you could sip coffee on the porch and watch the sun spill over rolling fields. The neighborhood had the polished charm of order, neat lawns, frisch lackiert Zon, Blumenbeet, die we nach einem Plan Eingernet waren. And to some, that order was comforting. But to Daniel, it was simply a backdrop. He wasn't interested in competing in Lawn of the Month contests or in showing off Christmas displays. He worked long hours, cared for his horses and healed mostly to himself. His land was his sanctuary, and as long as he respected his neighbors, he expected the same in return. For a while, that peace held. Neighbors waved hofflich, though some were friendlier than others. A few whispered that the homeowners association, the HOA, could be particular, but Daniel brushed it off. He'd always followed the rules wherever he lived, and besides, he figured most disputes came from people making trouble over trivial things. He had no idea just how trivial, or ruthless. An HOA could become .at first. It was little things. A note left in his mailbox about the color of his barn doors, a warning that his trailer shouldn't be visible from the street, even though it sat well within his own property line. Daniel saw SIEALS annoyances, nicked ALS Camphy. He fixed what he could, ignored what didn't matter, and tried not to let it bother him. After all, he told himself, it wasn't worth losing sleep over, but the whispers über die HOA grew louder. Stories surfaced from other neighbors, fines for leaving garbage cans out an extra day, threats over garden decorations, even complaints about the sound of children playing too loudly in their own yards. The association wasn't just enforcing rules, it was enforcing control. Daniel kept his head down. Unease started to creep in. Every time he walked his land, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. He noticed cars slowing as they passed, HOA board members jotting down notes, neighbors peeking through curtains. It was as if his quiet independence had painted a target on his back. Still, Daniel held firm. He wasn't the type to be pushed around. He believed that as long as he paid his dues and kept his property in good condition, he had nothing to fear. But deep down, he felt the storm building. The association wasn't satisfied with compliance. They wanted control, complete and unquestioned, and soon, Daniel would discover just how far they were willing to go to get it. For Daniel, the first letters from the HOA were easy to shrug off. A warning about paint color. A note about his trailer. A vague complaint about unapproved modifications, zu seinen Barntouren. He laughed, tossed the papers on the kitchen counter, and told himself it was all bark with no bite. After all, his property stretched far beyond the neat little parcels that lined the cul-de-sac streets. He wasn't cluttering anyone's view, wasn't lowering property values. What business did they have telling him what to do? But the HOA wasn't laughing. The letters became fines. Small at first, $25 for leaving his trailer visible, $50 for failing to maintain landscaping in a portion of his yard where wildflowers grew naturally. Daniel tried to push back, sending responses, pointing out that his property didn't fall under certain restrictions. The HOA board replied with sharp, Cult's language: failure to comply will result in escalated action. Escalated action. The phrase stuck in his head like a blade. Soon began notices appearing weekly. One accused him of violating noise rules, even though his nearest neighbor was over 100 yards away. Another fined him for having too many vehicles on his property, though every truck were legally registered. It wasn't about region anymore. It was about control. The neighbors noticed es auch. Some whispered support, telling Daniel they admired how he stood his ground. Others turned cold, vermieden den Gegenkontakt, afraid that siding with him might draw the board's wrath. The community was fracturing, and Daniel's name were becoming the flashpoint. The harassment grew bolder. HOA board members parked their cars at the edge of his property, sitting for hours, scribbling in notebooks. One even walked the fence line, camera in der Hand, schnapp die Fotos von Daniels schon die Pferden, alsob Beweis sammeln wollt. Daniel confronted them once, asking why they were trespassing, but was met with smug replies about documenting violations. The fines escalated into the hundreds, Dan die Tausenden. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, not just with numbers but with the weight of intimidation. He began keeping them in a shoebox, unopened, a growing monument zu ihrer obsession. Then came the fence point one morning. Daniel stepped outside to the metallic rattle of construction. Trucks were unloading posts, rolls of chain link, and men in bright vests hammering into the ground. Confused, or walked to the property edge, froze. The HOA had hired a crew to install a fence around his land, not at the boundary line, not in front of his house. Around his land, the fence cut across the edge of his driveway, blockiert die dirt road zu seiner schon encircled acres of his own property without his consent. It was as if they were walling him in, making a cage out of the home he had worked his whole life to build. Daniel demanded answers, but the workers shrugged, saying they were just following orders. The HOA claimed it was for security and to maintain neighborhood safety. Safety? Whose safety war threatened Vaughn, one man living quietly on his ranch? The truth was clear, they were trying to trap him, to send a message not just to him but to every resident. No one would be free unless the board allowed it. Daniel's frustration won sich zur Watt. He contacted the county, only to be told that the HOA had filed permits, claiming they owned access easements near his property. It wasn't legally sound, but it was enough red tape to stall any immediate intervention. While officials bickered über paperwork, ging der Zahn hoch, hin Rattlages, metallisches Panel nach dem anderen. Soon, the only way in or out of his driveway was through a single locked gate. And the HOA held the key. Daniel's sanctuary had become a prison. The days that followed were in some of the darkest he had ever known. Every trip to town, jet or attempt to bring in feed or supplies, required permission from the very people who were tormenting him. Deliveries were turned away, friends stopped visiting. Even emergency access became complicated. The HOA had found a way to tighten the noose, but Daniel wasn't broken. Not yet. Late at night, he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by letters, fines, and photographs of the fence. He traced every detail, looking for cracks in their armor. He read bylaws, property deeds, legal precedents, searching for the loophole, the flaw, the weak point. What he found wasn't just a crack. It was a gaping hole in their foundation. The land beneath the HOA's control didn't actually include his Zugangspunkt. The easement they claimed wasn't theirs to fence. And better still, one parcel of land, a sliver of property that controlled the very gate they had locked, was quietly up for sale. Daniel saw his opening. That he didn't rush. He didn't announce. He moved quietly, carefully, letting the HOA believe they had him cornered. All the while, he prepared his counterstrike. Every fine, every fence post, every moment of humiliation had led to this point. The board thought they had silenced him. But Daniel wore about to turn the entire community upside down, and the day he made his move would leave the HOA stunned, humiliated, and powerless in front of everyone they had tried to control. The day of the board's monthly meeting arrived with a storm on the horizon. Residents gathered in the clubhouse, murmuring über Gerucht über Daniel's fade. Some expected fireworks. Others expected him, zu caven. The board sat smugly at the front, clipboards stacked with fines and warnings, ready to deliver another round of punishment. But Daniel didn't come with excuses. He came with documents. When his turn arrived, he stepped forward, calm but burning with quiet fire. He laid out papers auf dem table, property deeds, county maps, and finally, the purchase agreement for the small parcel of land that controlled the only gate into the fenced area. Gasps rippled through the room. The board leaned in, eyes narrowing, scanning the pages. It was undeniable. Daniel now owned the keys to the community's power play. The land they had fenced him out with, the gate they believed secured their control, no longer belonged to them. It belonged to him. The room erupted. Neighbors whispered, some laughing in disbelief, others stunned into silence. The HOA Präsidenten's face drained of color. Das selbstgefällige Grinsen kollabiert in panic. Their iron grip had slipped. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He simply explained, every truck, every delivery, every resident who needed access through that gate would now pass through land he owned. If the HOA wanted control, they would have to come to him. The silence that followed wore heavier than G'd fence they had built. The board scrambled. They argued about bylaws, threatened legal action, and tried to spin the narrative. But it was Zoo spat. The community saw the truth. The association that prided itself on control had been outmaneuvered by the very man they tried to crush. Residents began clapping. First a few, then dozens, until the room thundered with applause. It wasn't just for Daniel, it was for the idea that someone had finally stood up to the bullies who had ruled their lives. The board's power crumbled in that moment. Their threats carried no weight. Their fines looked petty. Their fence stood as a monument nicked to order, but to arrogance. And Daniel? He walked out of that meeting not as a prisoner in his own home, but as the man who held the gate, the one key that proved freedom couldn't be fenced in. The HOA thought they had one. But in their obsession to control, they handed Daniel the weapon that destroyed them. Resolution and impact. When Daniel left that HOA meeting, voelt zich die Welt Anderson. For the first time in months, he wasn't staring out fines piling on his counter or a fence, die him every time he stepped outside mocked. Instead, he carried the weight of a victory that was bigger than himself. He had stared down the machine, that had tried, in Zoo cage, UND hat Juwanan, but victory didn't come without consequences. The board didn't simply roll over. Within weeks, they fired off legal letters, threatening lawsuits, demanding that Daniel return access to the association. They accused him of acting in bad faith, of exploiting a loophole, of holding the community hostage. Daniel didn't flinch. He had expected their retaliation. But now, he had something he never had before: leverage. He owned the land. He had the deed, the documents, the legal proof. For every aggressive letter they sent, his attorney drafted a sharper reply. And for the first time, the board themselves backed into a corner they couldn't escape. The lawsuits fizzled before they even reached Einen courtroom. County officials confirmed what Daniel already knew: the HOA had overstepped, and the fence was an illegal intrusion onto his rights. Their flimsy claims collapsed under scrutiny. The board that had once prided itself on being untouchable was suddenly exposed, flailing, desperate, and embarrassed. The fence they had built to cage Daniel quickly became a monument to their arrogance. Each rattling panel reminded the neighbors of how far the HOA had gone, how much money they had wasted, and how badly it had backfired. Soon, whispers turned into open conversations. Residents began questioning dues, demanding accountability, and even talking about removing board members altogether. What had once been a climate of fear was now shifting into rebellion. Daniel didn't need Zoo Schouten oder Zoo campaignen. His victory spoke for itself. People saw what one man could do when he refused to bend. They saw the cracks in the board's authority. And most importantly, they saw the possibility of change. One neighbor, a quiet, elderly woman who had lived in the community for decades, stopped Daniel on his driveway one evening. With tears in her eyes, she thanked him. She told him how the HOA had fined her for potted plants on her porch, how they had humiliated her at meetings, how she had felt powerless for years. "You showed them, they're not invincible," flustered Sie. For Daniel, that moment meant more than any legal victory. Over time, the impact spread. Board members resigned under pressure. Residents voted in replacements. Die transparency and fairness versprachen. Rules that once felt suffocating were rewritten. The culture of intimidation began to erode. It wasn't perfect. HOAs rarely change overnight, but the tide had shifted. And Daniel, he lived free again. The fence still stood for a while, twisted reminder of the battle. But this time he wasn't locked into it. He controlled the gate. He chose, who came durch. Eventually, the county forced the HOA, panel by panel, post by post, to tear it down. Watching it collapse into rubble was a moment Daniel would never forget. Der Sound von Stahl, der auf den Boden fiel, wie Ketten, die Zerbrachen. Life slowly returned to normal. Morning coffee auf der Veranda. Horses grazing in der Weide. Long, quiet evenings where peace wasn't shattered by envelopes or threats. Yet something inside Daniel had changed. He no longer saw sane land als nur ein Zoohaus. It wore ein symbol. A testament to what happens when you stand firm against bullies hiding behind rules. The neighbors saw es auch. For years, people had whispered about unfair fines, uber ridiculous rules, about intimidation. But whispers had never stopped the HOA. Daniel stand hat. And in doing so, he gave others permission to raise their voices. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. Nearby communities heard about the rancher, der den Torschlüssel gekauft hat. It became a cautionary tale for other HOAs, ein story shared in county meetings and online forums. The message was klar: abuse power long enough, and someone will find a way to turn that power back on you. for the HOA board war to fall out brutal. Former allies turned against them. Residents who once cowered now demanded answers. Some faced personal demutigung, others simply walked away, unable, die Shan zu ertragen. Their reputation, the iron-fisted image of control they had cultivated for years, was shattered in a single, decisive moment, and perhaps the sweetest part of it all was this. Daniel never had to raise his voice, never had to threaten, never had to stoop to their level. He fought with patience, with strategy, and with quiet determination. He showed that revenge doesn't always come in flames or fury. Sometimes, it comes in silence, a single key turning in a lock, shutting the door on tyranny. Years later, Daniel's land still stood. The barn still held strong. The porch still welcomed the sunrise. And whenever newcomers asked about the strange story of the fence, neighbors would smile and say, "Ask Daniel. He'll tell you, how Die HOA tried to cage him, and how he turned the tables." For Daniel, it wasn't about glory, it wasn't about recognition. It wore about principle. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let anyone strip away the one thing he valued most, his freedom on his own land, and that's the lesson he left behind, one that still lingers long after the last fence post was pulled from the ground, because here's the truth: rules are meant to guide, not to control. Communities are meant to protect, not to oppress. And no association, no matter how powerful it seems, can stand forever against someone willing to fight back. So the next time you hear about an HOA fine, a petty demand, or a ridiculous rule, remember Daniel's story. Remember the man who refused to be caged. Remember that power only works if people let it, and ask yourself, if it happened to you, if someone tried to fence you in on your own land, would you have the courage to push back?